Good morning. My name's Chris Lewis. I'm Head of Marketing for the Livingstone Group. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on Blueprint for Software Portfolio Management Optimization, presented by Clive Pugh. We'll be discussing how SPM can help align IT to business strategy and unlock substantial savings within the business and drive continual improvement within IT. Before Clive starts, I'd just like to introduce him. Clive heads up our software portfolio management practice, and he works with some of the world's biggest brands and some of our biggest clients. Clive has 15 years of experience in the IT industry. Prior to joining Livingstone, he led Dell EMC's asset management services team, and before that, he worked at Dimension Data running the software asset management teams there. We'll be taking questions at the end of the session. If you'd like to use the box below the video player, you can submit your questions during the session and we'll answer them at the end. If we don't get through all of them, we'll answer your questions individually following the call. So I'd like to now hand over to Clive Pugh to take you through today's session.
Thank you, Chris. What is software portfolio management? So the way that we look at it is it's an approach to provide access to the people, process and tool expertise across your entire software lifecycle. What do we mean by that? Well, actually, it's a way of bringing together your business function, your corporate services and your employee productivity together in one 360-degree view to really drive out the value of your investment and to allow you through the skills of your staff, catalog management, to deliver financial reporting. And therefore, that allows you to drive a continual improvement across your software portfolio. And we look at it from a portfolio perspective because traditionally, IT departments or even financial departments have looked at software very much as a compliance issue. Making sure that a company is fully licensed, fully compliant, and therefore spending what needs to be done to avoid the risk that entails, both from a vendor audit perspective and also from a reputational damage issue. But what we do with software portfolio management is to focus much further on the long-term strategic goals that you have as a business. To really maximize the investments that you make and be able to capture visibility of that so that you can report back into the business and therefore make the decisions that you need to around that. So how does that work? Effectively, we consciously touch on three pieces here. Firstly, how you consume and making sure that you get good visibility. So this is around trustworthy data, and that may come from a variety of tools. It may come from a variety of processes that you have in place at the moment. And people will be on varying parts of that journey as to how good the visibility and how good the management of that data actually is. The second part of it is around lifecycle management, around cost governance and accountability. And that's how you actually deliver the software through the course of the lifecycle, how you enable your infrastructure, how you enable your users to do their daily tasks, to drive your business and your business goals, both through optimization, renewals management, and then all the way through to the retirement of that software. And then how you procure, how do you buy right? What we look at is with trustworthy data and good lifecycle management, that enables you to then be able to drive better value by understanding what you actually consume, as opposed to perhaps what you're entitled to. That allows you to manage the software and cloud vendors, so you end up in a partnership that is actually beneficial to both of you, but allows you to drive better value when you're having those conversations. So the objectives of software portfolio management, it's really around the commercial outcomes to your organization. Traditionally, software asset management and ITAM has been around how you control your infrastructure, how you actually make sure that you're compliant, as I mentioned before. What we're actually looking at is this driving value to your business through your IT budget and your IT spend. how do you drive forward as an IT function actually aligned to the business strategy and the business requirements as dictated to by your overall C-level strategy, by your financial departments, and by your HR departments more and more as we come into this user-based subscription models. What you'll have found over the last couple of years is there's various announcements from the software vendors. You know, if we take Microsoft as an example, they've moved much more from a device-based licensing metric to the Office 365, now to the Microsoft 365 user subscription basis. If we take something like Splunk, you may be aware that only this month, Splunk have announced that they'll no longer be selling their perpetual licensing, and it's all going to be subscription. So that has its challenges, and that's around how you consume, but how you manage and negotiate. What we're looking at from SPM is really understanding the risks. So again, trustworthy data. How do you know what you're using? How can you make sure that you are using it in a secure manner? From a financial management, how do you actually know that the money that you're spending and investing is producing a return? Are the contracts you negotiate to the best partnership, not just around the cost, but also around delivering what you actually need? As we say, the more that the vendors move to a subscription model, it's more around the services that you consume. So not just the software, am I entitled to use a license, but actually how I consume that software and the services. Even more important when vendors are actually pushing more and more into a suite of licenses. How much of that suite is actually beneficial to me as a company and to my users from a day-to-day line of business? And all of that will fold into how you manage that relationship and how you contract management. So we're almost moving from an IT department to a finance department, and then we're coming around to a procurement and sourcing department. So it's really about that holistic, joined up approach. And then once that's all been negotiated and you have those relationships in place, how do you actually deliver and how do you manage the service level? i.e. from an IT department, the end users within your own company are your customers, and how do you service them so that they can actually do their day-to-day jobs and complete the tasks that they have. So that's really what SPM is looking to deliver. That's the objectives, a joined up approach to allow you to derive the best value from your spend, but at the same time deliver the services that drive your business forward. So how do we do that? What are the components for that? Well, I want to take a view of a customer that we dealt with earlier in this year, just as an example of the way they set up. Now, what we find is when we engage with customers, everyone will have certain aspects, and some of them will be fully defined, others will be fairly immature, i.e. at the start of the strategy. This particular customer was in a good place in the fact that they had already started to look at their users. And because of the industry they were in, there were some very clearly defined users. There were people from a business perspective that were not laptop or PC users, but needed access to email, needed access to SharePoint so they could look at company announcements, they could join company meetings, and even down to an HR function where they're actually looking at their payroll on a monthly basis. All the way up to the execs who obviously need to have full business management software, accessing from multiple devices, sometimes internally, sometimes remotely or on the move, and obviously needed to have something that delivered for that. So that's looking at line of business applications, that's looking at security profiles. That's an important aspect when we look at how people are actually accessing your business infrastructure. Then coming across to the software stack, as I say, there's going to be some within the stack that apply to all your personas, but there will be others that are very specific. A good example of that, I think, is always HR versus finance. There'll be line of business applications. So access may be very similar, but actually what they're consuming might differ slightly. And once you've got to that point when you've got your user personas and you understand the software stack against each of those, this particular company went to a catalog-based model. And what that allowed them to do was effectively define a cost against each of those personas. It allowed the individual departments to come in and be able to understand what the costs associated to deliver those packages to their staff were. And then that also allowed them, from a scalability perspective, to be able to say, well, if we're going to increase X department by Y, then we absolutely understand the individual cost from an IT perspective that will bring. And that will obviously allow forward planning from a budget perspective. It also allowed them to be able to look at individual applications that were being requested by the company, to go through an approval process, and then to know that when they published that to the catalogue, everyone else within the business knew that that was the preferred choice of technology. So not only did that allow them to look at the financial reporting on an individual user and on an individual department basis, but it also helps them mitigate things such as shadow IT, where you've got individuals or departments going off and purchasing applications that have not been approved by the business. From a financial perspective, once you have that granularity, and once you understand how people are consuming, rather than perhaps a once-a-year view around, I'd like to put a license position together to make sure that we're compliant as a business, actually what that allows you to do is to be able to look at it on a monthly basis. You can start to factor in things like joiners, movers and leavers, and that will allow you then to be dynamic in the way that you report. It will allow you to be dynamic in the way that you actually understand the return of investment that you've got. And therefore, when you actually go back to the business around any new initiatives, any upgrades, or even any requests from the business itself around what functionality might be needed that isn't in place at the moment, that all forms part of the business case as you roll that up into the budget cycle. From a financial perspective, it allows individual departments or even IT on its own to stand alone as a revenue or a profit center. And that obviously will be dictated by the strategy of the company, but the flexibility and the agility is there in place for those decisions to be able to be taken. At the same time, obviously, it gives you a very good indication of any risk associated to any shortfalls, any compliancy issues, or even, in fact, any business issues that might be defined by the overall company situation. And what I mean by that is, for example, a divestiture or an acquisition. If you're going to acquire a business, what is that going to do from a cost impact around the IT function? And from a management intelligence, once you have all of that from a financial reporting perspective, you can start to look at trends. If you're analysing that on a monthly basis or capturing that data on a monthly basis, we can look at storage costs, data creation and data analytics. So how as a business is your consumption actually affecting or aligning to the success of the overall business strategy? And you can build that into your forecasts. What that also allows you to do from a sourcing perspective is to have a discussion with a vendor that is based upon actual data, actual usage data, and that becomes incredibly powerful. It allows you to also forecast to your vendor and then make sure that when you're negotiating a contract, you've got the agility within that contract to understand that if you flex up, flex down, all of those implications have actually been discussed, been agreed, and you've got a contract that actually reflects reality for you. I wanted to touch on the user personas just briefly here. This is a very simplistic model, again, from another customer we had. And this was a situation where a customer was across a number of different entities, an IT department that was running as a service provider to multiple businesses within the group. What that meant was that one size did not fit all. It allowed them, by going to this catalogue-based approach, by actually starting to drill down to what personas look like, to be able to say, okay, for this particular entity, we have 3 personas. For the second entity, whilst in the group, but with a completely different business function, there was also 3 user profiles. From an IT perspective, those 3 didn't match, so actually they need to manage 6. And you'll see from the numbers, some of those actually change quite dramatically. When we look at identity, that's very much driven by how people are actually accessing the infrastructure, how they're accessing the network and the applications that they need to use. So again, it's not just around the software they're using, but it's also around how they access that. That has an impact around security, and that in itself will then feed down to the software stack that sits underneath each of those. So what we would do from a persona perspective is start at that level where we identify job function. We would look at how we would need to identify those from an access perspective. We would look at the numbers of users within each of those groups. Underneath each of those, there will be a stack of software products covering security, backup, line of business apps, etc. And that would allow the IT department to provision what was required. The second half of that is actually to understand if there's any movement. Are those numbers static in terms of users? Are they static for one particular persona or two personas? Is there a third one that actually is, for one reason or another, fluid? And if I go back to the first example that we discussed, that was a company that was involved in a number of joint ventures. And the benefit for them of the catalog approach that they had is actually they could spin up a joint venture. They could have third-party consultants or contractors or employees of the joint venture partner come in. They would be able to cost out the IT part of that. And actually, from a bid perspective, in terms of going out to the marketplace and winning something as a joint venture, they would be able to build that cost into their proposal and make sure that the final contract they had was actually profitable. So what we wanted to do was give you an example of how that might look like. And what we've got here is a piece where we look at aligning your sourcing to your consumption. What you'll see is there's 12 monthly pillars here. So this looks at a year, looks at your existing agreements, and what we found traditionally is people will pick the high point. They wish to remain compliant. They want to do the right thing. So they'll speak to the vendor and they'll align their contract to that. But actually, what they have is a flexible consumption. And that baseline consumption will go up or go down. And then you'll find that at least once a year, it will reach that baseline level that's been agreed with the vendor. And you see everything in red is really overspent, wastage. It doesn't give any benefit to the company, and it doesn't give any return of investment. What we look at with portfolio management is to say, well, okay, let's look at it from a different view. What is the minimum requirement that you need to contract at? And you'll see that has a different conversation when you're looking at your contract. It has a different conversation with the vendor. And then what you're looking at doing is saying, we'll contract that on an annual basis. We'll make sure our minimum requirement is for these items. And on a month-to-month basis, we have the data to be able to report that overage. And we will report what we use. And that will allow us to know that the revenue we spend, the investment we make is absolutely aligned to our requirement. And therefore that wastage disappears. It's efficient, it's agile, and it's predictable. We have a unit cost that is predictable, allows us to budget, and then we can look at that from a trend perspective. And from a portfolio management perspective, whilst this is one example, the end goal is to have all of your major vendors in that same methodology. I wanted to touch on a slightly different topic that is intrinsic to this value that we talk about. What we find when we sit down with some of our customers and we try to understand what their software spend is, very often they'll look at the revenues that they're paying on a monthly or an annual basis to their top 10. And they'll pick their top 10 because we also find that that generally is about 80 to 85% of their overall spend. They may even have a tail of another 200 vendors, but actually the top 10 usually forms the majority of their spend. The one thing that doesn't always come out is actually the legacy products they have, especially where they have actually spent money on licensing, secured perpetual rights, and the value of those rights have been written down over 3, 4, possibly 5 years, and effectively now are no longer seen sitting on the books. There's usually a major support cost associated to that, and as that product becomes older, the support cost increases. And there will be a tipping point at which the business will say it is actually more cost effective for us to buy new licenses and to retire that software. retire that hardware it sits upon and actually move to something that's a refreshed, cheaper to run, cheaper to license, or even moving into the cloud. But you do need to understand what that technical debt, that support cost associated is within your software portfolio. You need to understand how that affects the overall spend and commitment. And then understand how quickly that can change. So again, back to software portfolio management, how do you consume a line to service that you deliver to your end customers? For those technically minded, you'll see that this example is actually Microsoft SQL. And you can also see that the majority of instances are on very old kit. So not only does that get us to an increased support cost, but actually we start to get into the challenge with this particular customer around end of life, where it doesn't matter how much you're going to pay, actually what's going to happen is the vendor will refuse to support you anyway. And therefore you will need to move forward, and there will be a transformation cost associated to that. Again, it's about visibility back to the business so that those decisions can be made. And from a budget perspective, timelines can be agreed. So I wanted to cover, just as a wrap up, the way that we align those conversations. We work on a very simple target operating model, and we frame our conversations within those. That aligns to the ISO standard 19770-1. For those of you that have been doing this for a number of years, you remember the first iteration of that was a fairly detailed tone. And what we found is the 2017 is actually much more around how you implement. And you'll recognize the tiers. And this comes back to the initial slide that we talked about. Tier 1 being trustworthy data. How do you understand what your consumption is? Tier 2 around governance, lifecycle management. And then Tier 3 is the optimization. How do you buy better? And how do you drive those negotiations? From a software portfolio management, I just wanted to briefly touch on the future demand and portfolio management within that Tier 3 of optimization. Future webinars will go into more detail around the negotiation and benchmarking support and around your vendor commercial solutions. But at the moment, within SPM, what we wanted to do was just to show how this target operating model aligns to those three pieces. It's around data, trustworthy data, and the insights that can provide, and how that then wraps into your service delivery as an IT function. And then that moves into your future demand and your portfolio management. What we talk about from a portfolio management within this box in Tier 3 is really around your financial reporting, understanding your costs, understanding your return on investments, and then understanding your trending. And that really builds into the future demand process. So that's software portfolio management at a high level. So hopefully today has given you an introduction to software portfolio management or clarified some of the thinking that you already have. For me, thank you for listening. Chris, back to yourself. See if there's any questions that have come through.
Thanks, Clive. We've had quite a few questions. We won't be able to answer them all today, but we will get back to everybody who's sent them through with answers to specific questions. If you have any questions on any of the issues raised today or any of the points that you'd like clarified, please contact us at marketing@livingstone-tech.com. So for the first question, Clive, do you recommend looking at all vendors in one exercise or concentrating on one at a time in turn? What do you believe is the best approach?
I think what we find is with most customers, to concentrate across your entire software stack is actually a really complex piece of work to do. And it really comes back to effort to reward. It will depend upon the scale of your existing team, where you currently are in terms of how you manage your software. Typically, I'd be recommending that you actually prioritize your vendors, and that will be done by contract expiration dates. You know, what is coming up for renewal, and therefore what do you need to be looking at? Although at the same time, I'm going to suggest that actually you start looking at things a good 9 months before they do renew. Looking at the overall spend, just to give you a view, obviously, in terms of actual return of investment, and therefore the opportunity for cost savings and deriving value. And then the strategic importance, to understand what your business is requiring you to deliver. And I think once you've got that view of what the priorities are, is to then be able to say, what do I have from a team perspective or a partner engagement? What can I manage? You know, from a sourcing team, you can probably only manage 2 or 3 major negotiations at one time. From an IT department, it may be the fact that actually you want to look at the top 5 because you're going out and you're investigating things, and therefore you may want to do that as one. But I'd suggest that it's probably a case of working out where your major investments are, understanding what your resource capabilities are, and then coming up with a strategic plan. And obviously, once you've gone through the first tranche, you can step down to the second. And I think what you'll find is that having gone through that first tranche of vendors, your second and your third iteration will just be a much smoother piece of work as well.
Okay, great. Okay, next question. Is there a benefit in a catalog-based approach if we don't internally cross-charge for users?
Yes. And I think what we find with customers that do this is around control, and it's around visibility. So the chargeback process is fantastic from a financial department if you want your department to actually take ownership of budgets, to actually understand that there is an implication to what they're buying. But I think what we do with the catalogue is actually you go through a process of onboarding approved software. I mentioned before about trying to avoid shadow IT. It gives you a real framework to actually manage that life cycle. It also gives you the ability from a finance and an IT department to actually, if you're not charging back, to at least show back so that end users can understand there is an implication. It does change behavior, even if they're not fundamentally managing a budget. If they understand there's a cost associated to the business, then that's something that can be fed back in. Again, I think it also, from that showback perspective, allows you to make business cases for change, for transformation, for upgrades, from move to on-premise to cloud, cloud to on-premise, again, depending on where your strategy happens to lie. But it certainly allows you to get more control.
Okay, great. And where should the ownership of SPM actually sit within an organisation in your experience?
ITAM and SAM has been a strange journey, I think. Traditionally, it's sat with IT departments. It's become, over the last few years, much more of a financial ownership. So moving from perhaps the CIO or CTO up to the FD or the CFO. But what we find here is that it works best when it's a collaborative partnership. IT being able to look at the trustworthy data and service management, finance to be able to clearly articulate the reporting that they wish for, and then the ability for sourcing and procurement to both negotiate but also to manage those vendor relationships to derive the value. So in terms of where it should sit, I think you need a very senior sponsor so that this is successful, but at the same time it's a very much closely working partnership between sourcing, finance and IT.
Thanks, Clive. Unfortunately, that's about all we have time for on today's call. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. Following the session, we'll be releasing our latest blueprint, a guide to software portfolio management. We'll email everyone who attended a link, so you can go to a page on our website where you can complete a simple form to request a copy. Again, if you'd like to ask any further questions or would like to speak to us about any of the points raised today, please don't hesitate to contact us by emailing marketing@livingstone-tech.com or visiting our website and filling out the contact us form. Thank you very much and goodbye.